The King of the Ring tournament has finally returned, which has many fans excited since this event has often served as a precursor for a wrestler's eventual turn at claiming greatness. However, heavy is the head that wears the crown, and hindsight is 2020. And as we look back at past monarchs of the mat, some have failed to live up to the lineage of King. Thus, I figured that it's high time to examine some of these previous winners and also put out a suggestion of who, considering the times in retrospect, should have taken home the majestic title. Because today, Dave knows 7 wrestlers who should have been King of the Ring. First, let's start with the very first tournament. Now, I have mentioned previously that before it was a pay-per-view, King of the Ring started out as a live show supercard event, with WWF's very first King of the Ring tournament taking place on July 8th, 1985. And the final saw the OG Rock, Don Morocco, going against the Iron Sheik, where Morocco would become the very first king ever. However, as magnificent as Morocco was, he would never become a WrestleMania main eventer. But you know who was? King Kong Bundy. While Bundy would never win the WWF World title, in the year to come, he would work his way into main eventing WrestleMania 2 against Hulk Hogan. And in order to really build Bundy as an even more credible threat to Hogan, being the very first King of the Ring winner would have been a great extra feather in the cap, in addition to the storyline that they already had in place. Not to mention that this could have even started a tradition of having the King of the Ring winner getting a title shot at WrestleMania before the Royal Rumble ever even existed, which, since it would have happened in the summer of the previous year, would have also served as a solid piece of great long-term booking. In 1990, there was no winner, as the tournament unfortunately took a year off. Furthermore, between the years of 1989 and 1991, we would see a lot of things begin to change in the WWF. It was the start of a new decade, Hogan would lose the title to the Ultimate Warrior, and a general changing of the guard was beginning to take shape. Now sure, 1990 was dominated by both Hogan and the Warrior, and Hogan would eventually take his title back at WrestleMania 7. But during this time, there was also another major star who managed to feud with both the Hulkster and the Warrior in the same year, as well as winning another tournament in 1990. Who is this wrestler? I'm talking about Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect would go into 1990 with an undefeated streak, but even though he would eventually suffer losses at both the hands of the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan, Perfect would go on to defeat the previous year's King of the Ring winner, Tito Santana, in a tournament for the vacant WWF Intercontinental title, after the Warrior was made to drop the IC strap after winning the WWF World Championship at WrestleMania 6. But as far as I'm concerned, instead of having an Intercontinental title tournament, the belt should have just been put up for grabs at the 1990 King of the Ring that never happened instead, resulting in us not only getting a proper king to start the 1990s, but we would also be getting the perfect king at that. An entrant up for retconning that really should come as no surprise to anyone, King Mabel wasn't exactly the most revered king, as his reign ultimately led nowhere. Now, this was a difficult time for WWF, as their transition period had now gone into full swing, thus making it really hard to decipher who the next king should be. But if I had to give it to someone, I might as well pick the wrestler that I was actually rooting for at the time, Razor Ramon. I mean, he never won the WWF World title, he never main evented a WrestleMania, and he never even won a Royal Rumble. So come on, McMahon, you could have at least made the bad guy the bad king. In 1998, right in the heart of the Attitude Era, the King of the Ring goes down in history as a major event. But while a certain Mick Foley match no doubt steals the show, it's unfortunate that many tend to overlook 1998's royal winner, Ken Shamrock. And while there's no shame in living in Mick Foley's shadow, what really doesn't help the situation is that Shamrock never really climbed to the heights that many expected him to as a main eventer in the WWF. Not only that, but this crowning also seems especially mismatched when you remember who Shamrock defeated in the finals to win it, because Ken took down a wrestler who would go on to win another tournament just several months later, The Rock. After becoming the WWF champion by winning the 1998 Survivor Series tournament, The Rock would go on to become one of the biggest megastars in all of wrestling history. So in hindsight, it probably would have been much better to have The Rock win it instead. Also, try to remember that while The Rock did have an absolutely outstanding career outside of championships, The Rock doesn't really have too much in the way of extracurricular WWE accolades, aside from a single Royal Rumble win where both of his feet actually did touch the floor. And let me make it clear that winning a plethora of titles and a Royal Rumble is nothing to scoff at. I'm just saying that since he is one of the biggest megastars of all time, and since he was already set to win a tournament in 1998 anyway, a King of the Ring victory is actually way more fitting for a People's Champion than it was for Ken Shamrock. 1999 was an interesting year. With the transitional period definitely over, WWE had something of a different problem not seen since the Hogan days, where the main event scene was mostly set. Sure, Triple H would pick up his first WWE title in this year, but he had already won the honor of being king just 2 years prior, so picking up another crown really wouldn't have helped him all that much. Moreover, keep in mind that a lot of major stars of the company were still not there yet at this time. But if there was one emerging face in WWF that could have done well to get a big to-do early on in their career for the House of McMahon, it would have to be The Big Show. Debuting earlier in 1999, Paul White would find himself main eventing WrestleMania 2000 and eventually winning a whole slew of titles, including the WWE Championship itself. However, while he would accomplish quite a lot, his size has been both a plus and a minus for his career. He's so big that he can instantly be put into the main event scene without anyone ever questioning it. But the downside is that he doesn't get a whole lot of focus placed on his booking since he's usually just taken for granted. On the other hand, if the Big Show dominated a King of the Ring tournament just a few months into his debut in the company, it backs up his whole scary factor and puts everyone else on notice. The way I see it, the Biggest also needs to occasionally remind people of why he can also be the baddest. Plus, custom making a giant cape and crown would either telegraph to the audience that he was definitely winning, or having him wear a regular size one would be pretty funny. So the way I see it, it's a win-win no matter what. While there is no doubt that Edge dominated the WWE main event scene for a long period of time, I still don't see him as the best possible option to be king in 2001, considering that after winning it, Edge wouldn't become WWE champion until 5 whole years later in 2006. Meanwhile, during that time, the following year's king Brock Lesnar would go on to win the title, main event WrestleMania, and leave the company, all before Edge even picked up World Title 1. Not to mention that Edge's cash-in of his Money in the Bank contract against John Cena was grand enough to push him into main event status without needing the crown to legitimize him. Furthermore, Edge would also pick up a Royal Rumble victory, and he would also get nuclear levels of heat after the whole Lita thing, continuing to make his turn as king completely unnecessary. But going beyond Edge, the end of 2001 would make wrestling history, as the WWF would see a wrestler do what no one has ever done before, when Chris Jericho became the very first undisputed champion. Now, there are some people who feel that Chris Jericho's milestone victory was a bit rushed, and while I totally disagree with that since I think the dusty finish with Triple H alone solidified him as a main event player, a King of the Ring victory might have done some good to remove all doubt from his detractors. And adding to the point, Jericho would never win a King of the Ring, nor would he win a Royal Rumble, and he didn't even get to win a Money in the Bank despite coming up with the concept himself. So I'm just saying, in Chris Jericho's case, a crown definitely would have gone really nicely with 2 belts. And finally, with Sheamus already being an established main event player in WWE, him winning yet another accolade with the King of the Ring really didn't boost his stock all that much. And let's also remember that like Edge and unlike Jericho, Sheamus, in addition to being king, has also won both the Royal Rumble and the Money in the Bank, further showcasing how this wasn't needed for the Celtic Warrior and that it was also just taking away a significant push away from someone else. Like who, you ask? Well, while I would have loved to explore an alternate universe in which Wade Barrett had won this year instead of in 2015, and the Nexus would have been pushed the way they should have been, he isn't my pick to be coronated. Nope. Instead, I say the winner should have been a wrestler who is about to become a top guy in WWE and also the voice of the voiceless, CM Punk. While Punk had already held WWE's World Heavyweight Championship back in 2008, the WWE Championship would elude him until Money in the Bank in 2011. Now, in between that time, there was a perfectly good crown that could have been won in order to signify that not only would he be King of the Ring, but he would also be the king in WWE, eventually holding on to the championship for well over a year. Not to mention that King Punk definitely has an interesting sound to it. Well, there you go, 7 wrestlers that I think should have been King of the Ring, but what are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comments who you think should have been king. Oh, and by the way, this year it should have been Cesaro. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.